Philippine Sea, November 1944. A pale dawn breaks over an ocean that seems endless. The water glows in shades of steel and ash as low clouds drift above a distant horizon. On the bridge of a Japanese cruiser, officers stand motionless, binoculars fixed eastward. At first, they see nothing. Then faint specks in the morning haze. Dozens. Then hundreds. Engines roar in growing unison, the air vibrating with a metallic hum that shakes the windows. From beyond the horizon, a formation of American aircraft bursts through the clouds. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, in perfect geometric precision. Below, the sea itself seems alive. Carriers stretch to the edge of vision, each one a floating city of steel and motion. From every deck, aircraft thunder into the sky, one every few seconds, their wings folding and unfolding like clockwork. The Japanese officers whisper in disbelief. One murmurs a phrase that will be recorded later. They launch as if the ships are machines, not men. In that moment, they realize Japan's naval war is no longer fought by equals. The age of the Essex-Class has arrived. In the early months of 1942, Japan ruled the Pacific. Her carrier fleet, the Kido Butai, had struck Pearl Harbor, shattered the pride of the U.S. Navy, and projected power across thousands of miles of ocean. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had operated with unmatched coordination. The world watched in astonishment as Japanese air wings conquered the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies in a storm of precision strikes. For a brief moment, the Pacific seemed a Japanese lake. The rising sun flag flew from Singapore to Wake Island. American morale was shaken, and the idea of matching Japan's carrier force felt almost impossible. But in shipyards along the American coast, a quiet revolution was already underway. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, U.S. naval planners had begun designing a new generation of carriers. They called it the Essex-Class, a vessel larger, faster, and infinitely more adaptable than anything afloat. It was not meant to be a single masterpiece of engineering. It was meant to be built in numbers. Each Essex would carry over 90 aircraft, displacing more than 27,000 tons. Its armored hangar decks, twin hydraulic catapults, and powerful elevators could move aircraft faster than any previous design. The ship structure allowed repairs to be made at sea. Its design standardized so parts could be replaced interchangeably, a modular philosophy decades ahead of its time. The Japanese built carriers as symbols of naval prestige. The Americans built them as tools of war, efficient, repeatable, industrial. After Midway in June 1942, when Japan lost 4 of its elite fleet carriers, the balance began to shift. The U.S. had lost the Yorktown and Lexington, but the Essex-class blueprints were already in the hands of every major shipyard. By late 1942, the first hulls took shape in Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia. Welding torches lit the night like fireflies across the docks. Each Essex took roughly 20 months to build, less than half the time of Japan's fastest carrier project. But America's real advantage was scale. While Japan struggled to replace Akagi and Kaga, the U.S. laid down hull after hull. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were at sea. By the end of 1944, there were 16. The industrial mathematics were merciless. For every ton of carrier steel Japan produced, the United States produced 20. Yet it wasn't only material abundance that changed the war, it was doctrine. American naval aviation evolved under relentless experimentation. Pilots returning from the Solomons brought combat data, which engineers translated into mechanical upgrades. Elevator speeds were increased. Hangar workflows were redesigned. Deck crews practiced cyclic operations, launching one full strike group while the next was being armed below deck. Each Essex became not a single ship but part of a living machine, synchronized with destroyer screens, cruisers, and supply ships in one fluid system. Behind this transformation stood Admiral Ernest J. King and the Bureau of Ships, who demanded standardization across the fleet. If one part fails, a memo read, it must be replaced by another made a continent away. America had turned war into industry, and industry into precision warfare. Meanwhile, Japanese naval intelligence watched with growing alarm. Reports filtered back from submarines and coast watchers. New American carriers larger than anything seen before, launching squadrons with mechanical rhythm. Tokyo dismissed some of these as exaggerations until late 1943, when the Essex-Class made its debut at Rabaul and Tarawa. At Tarawa, USS Essex and her sister ships Bunker Hill and Yorktown unleashed coordinated waves of aircraft that erased enemy airfields within hours. The Japanese defenders called it continuous attack, an alien concept to their doctrine of single decisive blows. For the first time, the Imperial Navy faced an enemy whose carriers did not tire, whose air wings could be replaced faster than destroyed. By early 1944, the Essex-Class was no longer an experiment, it was a system. A machine designed for perpetual motion across an ocean the size of a planet. And that system was now moving west, toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. By the start of 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become an American production line of power. Convoys of tankers, ammunition ships, and repair tenders stretched from California to the Marshall Islands. Bases like Pearl Harbor, Majuro, and Ulithi turned from outposts into floating industrial zones, with airfields, dry docks, and depots working day and night. Amid this vast logistical network sailed the Essex-Class carriers, the core of a new creation, the Fast Carrier Task Force, known to history as Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher, and later Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey. No navy had ever attempted what these formations represented: dozens of carriers, battleships, and cruisers moving together as a single striking organism. Each task group had its rhythm. While one wave of aircraft launched, another refueled. While one deck rearmed, another recovered damaged planes. Carriers rotated responsibilities like the gears of a clock, ensuring that American aircraft were always in the sky. The Japanese Navy had once defined naval air warfare with the Kido Butai. But this was something else entirely. The Kido Butai was an elite sword. The Essex fleet was an entire factory of war. Every launch cycle was timed to seconds. A single carrier could send off more than 40 planes in 15 minutes, but a task group of 4 Essex-class ships could keep that tempo rolling for hours. On the flight deck, men moved in color-coded vests. Yellow for directors, green for catapult crews, purple for fuel, red for ordnance. The organization looked almost choreographed, yet every movement served efficiency and safety. At sea, the pace was relentless. Launch, recover, rearm, refuel, the cycle never ended. The sound of the catapults, the smell of hot fuel, the vibration of engines below deck. These were the heartbeat of America's naval power. In the early months of 1944, this new machine began its test. The target, the Marshall Islands, Japan's outer defensive ring. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, the Essex-class carriers proved their doctrine. Within hours, enemy airfields were neutralized. Within days, Japanese naval aviation in the region ceased to exist. By June 1944, the U.S. fleet advanced again, this time toward the Mariana Islands. Here, the Essex-class carriers reached their first great crescendo, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to Japanese aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 500 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The cause was not just American pilot skill, it was the system behind them. The radar control rooms below the flight decks, the efficient refueling stations, the replacement aircraft waiting in hangars already armed. Japanese commanders, including Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, watched in disbelief. Their few surviving airmen returned to ships that could no longer launch counterstrikes. The difference was no longer tactical, it was existential. Back in Tokyo, naval planners attempted to understand what they were facing. Reports from the front described fleets that could replace an entire air group between dawn and dusk, and carriers that seemed impervious to exhaustion. Admiral Toyoda's intelligence division began calculating sortie rates. When they realized that American carriers were launching as many as 100 planes every 9 minutes across multiple decks, the numbers seemed impossible. To Japanese officers raised on Bushido and the value of individual heroism, such mechanical consistency was beyond imagination. But for the Americans, it was the result of organization, not mystique. Every component, from the engine crews below deck to the ordnance handlers above, functioned as a link in one chain of precision. When a Hellcat or Helldiver roared down the deck, dozens of unseen hands had already prepared its path, fueled its tanks, and armed its payload in under 12 minutes. By autumn 1944, as the Allies advanced toward the Philippines, Task Force 38 was the largest concentration of naval air power in history. Its aircraft could sweep entire regions clean of resistance in a matter of hours. Its reach extended over 1,500 miles of ocean. The Japanese Empire, once spread across the Pacific like a vast constellation, now found its stars going dark one by one. And in the weeks ahead, as the American carriers massed off Leyte Gulf, the world would witness the full measure of that power. The Essex-Class fleet was about to unleash a tempo of destruction no navy had ever seen. The technological angle. The Essex-Class was not designed for glory, it was designed for endurance. Every feature, every screw, every elevator had a single purpose: to launch and recover aircraft faster, safer, and more often than any enemy could imagine. Earlier American carriers like the Yorktown had been experimental, streamlined, elegant, but fragile. The Essex changed that completely. It was a warship engineered for mass production and brutal service. The hangar decks were open and expansive, allowing entire wings of Hellcats or Avengers to be rolled forward in minutes. Hydraulic aircraft elevators, 3 per ship, could lift fully armed bombers from the hangar to the flight deck in under 20 seconds. Its catapults used high-pressure hydraulic systems that hurled aircraft into the air at 75 miles per hour from a standstill. The arresting gear, steel cables stretched across the deck, could absorb the impact of 20-ton planes landing at 85 knots, one after another, in a rhythm that rarely faltered. The technology of the Essex wasn't cutting-edge for its own sake. It was cutting-edge for reliability. Everything could be maintained at sea. If a catapult jammed, engineers had access hatches beneath the deck to repair it mid-operation. If an elevator failed, spare parts were already aboard, pre-manufactured to standard dimensions shared across all Essex-Class carriers. That standardization meant one ship's experience improved all others. A mechanical fix discovered aboard the USS Bunker Hill could be radioed across the Pacific and implemented the same day on USS Intrepid or USS Hancock. The fleet learned together as a network, not a collection of isolated vessels. This was the first distributed technological ecosystem in naval history, and it gave the Americans something Japan never had: the ability to evolve in real time. The industrial angle. Behind the Essex-Class lay a machine far greater than any single fleet, the full weight of American industrial mobilization. When Franklin D. Roosevelt announced that America would become the arsenal of democracy, few grasped what that would mean. By 1943, American factories produced a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day, and a new carrier every 2 weeks. The Essex-Class carriers were assembled like automobiles. Shipyards used prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting to speed production. The same techniques used in Detroit car plants found their way into naval engineering. Workers who once built trucks for Ford now welded the skeletons of carriers in Brooklyn and Norfolk. Japan, by contrast, relied on small-scale artisan shipbuilding. Each carrier was a handcrafted project, built in specialized yards with limited resources. The Taiho, Japan's late-war supercarrier, took nearly 2 years to complete, during which time the United States launched 7 Essex-Class carriers. It was not simply a race of technology, it was a race of systems. America's Navy drew power from a continent unified by railways, factories, and workforce mobilization. Every bolt that held an Essex together could be traced back to a supply chain stretching from Pittsburgh steel mills to Kansas aircraft plants and California refineries. By 1944, America's shipbuilding capacity had achieved something staggering: 24 Essex-Class carriers either operational or under construction simultaneously. Japan, with its industry bombed and starved of resources, could not hope to match even a fraction of that. The result was visible in the Pacific. Wherever Japan deployed 1 carrier, America deployed 10. Wherever Japan launched 80 aircraft, America launched 800. The ocean itself became a stage for industrial mathematics, and Japan was running out of numbers. The tactical angle. Technology and production meant little without doctrine. And here, too, the Essex-Class became the centerpiece of a revolution. Before the war, navies treated carriers as fragile instruments, operating cautiously and often alone. But American admirals like Mark Mitcher and Raymond Spruance realized that the Essex-Class could operate as part of a synchronized strike system. Instead of one carrier launching a single, decisive blow, entire groups of carriers launched overlapping waves. This was the birth of the cyclic operation, a tactical pattern where flight decks were never idle. In a typical Essex-Class task group, while one deck launched aircraft, another recovered, and a third rearmed. Planes in the air received fresh instructions from radar-directed controllers aboard the carriers, maintaining constant pressure on the enemy. Every 9 minutes, somewhere in the task force, a launch bell rang, signaling another wave of Hellcats and Avengers roaring into the sky. This tempo broke the traditional rhythm of naval warfare. For the Japanese, combat was a sequence of distinct phases: launch, fight, retreat, regroup. For the Americans, combat became a continuous flow. Even as damaged planes returned, replacements were already airborne. The enemy never saw an empty sky. Admiral Mitcher described the philosophy simply: keep them turning. If you're not launching, you're losing. The Essex-Class made that possible. Vast hangar decks, efficient elevators, massive fuel storage, and precision coordination allowed fleets to sustain operations around the clock. In the Marianas and later at Leyte Gulf, this system turned battles into industrial symphonies. By 1944, Japanese lookouts no longer counted planes, they counted minutes between attacks. Each minute felt shorter than the last. The Essex-Class had become the mechanical expression of America's war doctrine: relentless, organized, and unstoppable. But the true meaning of that power would only become clear when seen through human eyes: the men who lived inside the machine, and those who watched it from across the ocean, powerless to resist. The human angle. For the men aboard the Essex-Class carriers, war was not fought in grand maneuvers. It was lived minute by minute on steel decks, in engine rooms, and under the constant thunder of engines. The rhythm of life was mechanical, yet intensely human. On flight decks, yellow-shirt directors guided aircraft with hand signals that meant life or death. The roar of engines, the wind of propellers, and the acrid scent of aviation fuel filled the air. Below decks, mechanics worked in temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, repairing engines and refueling planes by the glow of red battle lights. They slept in hammocks beneath racks of bombs, knowing one spark could end everything. Yet morale aboard the Essex-Class carriers remained remarkably high. The crews understood their place in something immense, a machine built not only of steel but of trust. Each man relied on hundreds of others: pilots on deck crews on ordnance handlers, handlers on the engineers below. Letters home spoke of exhaustion and pride in equal measure. "We launch until our arms ache," wrote one plane handler from the USS Intrepid. "But every time the deck clears, the sky fills with our planes. You can almost feel the war tipping." For pilots, the Essex-Class was both cradle and crucible. They launched into skies filled with flak and fire, knowing that behind them was not just a ship, but an entire floating nation of support. They called it the Big Blue Blanket, the endless swarm of Hellcats and Avengers covering the fleet, always there, always circling. This human ecosystem, from cooks to captains, was what made the Essex-Class unstoppable. Machines could be built anywhere, but this kind of cohesion could only be forged by relentless training and a shared belief that every man mattered. The enemy angle. On the other side of the Pacific, Japanese officers could only watch in disbelief. From the decks of cruisers and destroyers, they saw what no other navy had ever faced: an enemy that attacked not in waves, but in storms. Reports from survivors describe skies so crowded with aircraft that the sound became a single unbroken roar. It was as if the sea itself had grown wings. One Japanese ensign wrote after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Every few minutes, another squadron appeared. First bombers, then fighters, then torpedo planes, as if the Americans had an infinite supply. Japanese intelligence officers tried to quantify what they saw. They counted launches and recoveries, noting the intervals between waves. when they realized that the Americans were coordinating their decks so precisely that new strikes rose every 9 minutes. Even the most experienced commanders were shaken. For years, Japan's naval air arm had been built around elite skill. Small cadres of expert pilots trained through years of rigorous practice. But by 1944, most of those aces were gone. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated courses, faced Americans who were not only better equipped but supported by radar guidance, efficient logistics, and carrier doctrines that guaranteed overwhelming numbers. The enemy's despair was not only tactical, it was psychological. Japanese officers realized that courage and devotion, the pillars of their Bushido tradition, were useless against a system that replaced men and machines faster than they could be destroyed. When they looked through binoculars and saw rows of Essex-Class carriers lined across the horizon, each one the size of a city block, each one launching squadrons in perfect rhythm, they understood something terrifying. The Americans had mechanized victory itself. In that moment, admiration and dread became indistinguishable. The leadership angle. Behind this immense orchestration stood men whose vision redefined naval warfare. Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood that control of the air meant control of the sea. His calm leadership and faith in carrier aviation turned the Essex-Class fleet into a weapon of continuous movement. Mitcher's command style was simple. Give clear orders, trust your officers, and keep the carriers turning into the wind. He rarely spoke loudly, but his crews revered him. During the Philippine sea operations, he watched the sky darken with returning aircraft at night and ordered, against standard procedure, turn on the lights, get them home. It was a human act in the midst of mechanical war, one that saved hundreds of pilots. Admiral William Bull Halsey, meanwhile, embodied aggression. Under his Task Force 38, the Essex-Class became a blunt instrument of total destruction. His orders were short and visceral. Hit hard, hit fast, hit often. Together, Mitcher and Halsey created a rhythm, precision and fury, intellect and instinct, that made the American fleet unstoppable. Supporting them was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, whose strategic patience ensured that the Essex-Class carriers were never risked needlessly. He saw beyond battles. He saw logistics, timing, and morale as weapons equal to bombs. It was Nimitz who coordinated the flow of men, materials, and fuel across 6,000 miles of ocean, ensuring that no carrier ever went hungry, no deck ever went dark. Their combined leadership turned an industrial advantage into operational dominance. Each man commanded not only ships but an idea that in the modern age, war was no longer about singular heroes, but about the synchronization of thousands. By the autumn of 1944, that synchronization had reached its peak. The Essex-Class fleet had become a living engine of war, technological, human, and strategic components working in perfect alignment. Ahead lay the test that would define them all, the battle for the Philippines. There, under storm clouds and over endless seas, Japan would witness the full terror of an enemy that could launch 100 planes every 9 minutes. October 1944, the Philippines. The tropical heat pressed down like a physical weight. Typhoon winds rolled across the archipelago, whipping waves into white crests, and over the horizon, a wall of gray smoke hung over the sea. Below that haze, nearly 300 American warships moved as one, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all converging on a single objective: to liberate the Philippines and sever Japan's final lifeline to the oil of the Dutch East Indies. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled. At its heart sailed 17 Essex-Class carriers, each packed with nearly 100 aircraft. Their decks glistened under the tropical sun as flight crews in color-coded uniforms moved like clockwork. Every 9 minutes, across hundreds of miles of ocean, American aircraft thundered into the air, a constant rhythm that pulsed through the Pacific like a heartbeat. For Japanese commanders, the operation represented a desperate gamble. Admiral Somu Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, launched Operation Shogo, a complex plan involving 3 fleets converging on Leyte Gulf from north, center, and south. The goal was to draw the American carriers away from the invasion beaches by using a decoy force of nearly empty Japanese carriers. But what Toyota did not yet grasp was that the American fleet no longer operated like his own. Where Japan divided its carriers into fragile spearheads, the United States fused its Essex-class ships into a single, flexible organism. The decoy might succeed against individual admirals, but not against a system built to adapt within hours. As dawn broke on October 24th, Task Force 38 launched the first of many strikes. Over the sea beyond sea, radar screens aboard USS Essex and USS Lexington flickered to life, tracking the Japanese center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita, a fleet that included the massive battleship Musashi. In the ready rooms, pilots tightened gloves and listened to the droning engines above. The order came down, launch all groups. The first wave roared off the decks, Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, climbing in staggered formations. Within an hour, they found Kurita's ships. The attacks came in relentless sequence, each squadron guided by radar and relayed coordinates from scout planes. By midday, the Musashi had been hit by dozens of bombs and torpedoes. American pilots described her as a mountain in the sea, shaking apart piece by piece. Each strike group returned to its carrier, rearmed, and launched again. From the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Kurita watched the horizon vanish behind clouds of black smoke and churning water. His men counted the waves of American aircraft. 1, then 2, then 3, until they lost track entirely. There was no pause, no moment to regroup. Japanese officers later recalled that it was not battle, but demolition. On the American side, coordination reached a new level of precision. Flight decks turned like gears, one launching as another recovered. Commanders aboard USS Essex and USS Intrepid synchronized takeoff signals by stopwatch and radio tone, ensuring that no carrier disrupted another's airflow. At 1,400 hours, the Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita's force staggered westward, retreating through waters littered with oil and wreckage. But the day was far from over. Hundreds of miles to the north, another Japanese force, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy carriers, steamed south, nearly empty of aircraft but designed to lure the Americans away from Leyte. At first, the plan worked. Admiral William Halsey, eager for decisive action, turned his task force north to strike the remaining Japanese carriers. As Task Force 38's Essex-class ships raced toward the decoys, Kurita regrouped and turned back toward the vulnerable American landing force. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos. Yet within that chaos, the Essex-class carriers remained the most stable element of the entire war machine. Their crews continued launching, recovering, and relaunching in perfect cycles, adapting on the fly to new coordinates and new threats. On Japanese ships, officers stood in silence as they watched the unfolding spectacle. Through clouds of smoke, they saw American formations moving with terrifying precision, aircraft attacking from multiple directions, diving in rhythm, vanishing, and being instantly replaced. One officer aboard the cruiser Yamato later wrote, "They fight as machines. We fight as men. And the machines are winning." As dusk fell, the sea was littered with burning oil and drifting wreckage. The sky above Leyte was streaked with contrails, as if carved by the claws of war itself. But the decisive moment, the one that would seal the fate of the Imperial Navy, was still to come. The next day, the full power of the Essex-class would converge on the remnants of Japan's carrier force, demonstrating not just dominance, but inevitability. October 25, 1944, dawn. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea, casting a red-orange glare across calm water, the deceptive calm before history's largest naval air battle. To the north, for Japanese carriers, Zuikiku, Zuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda steamed under the command of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. They were the remnants of the once proud Kido Butai, the same striking force that had launched Pearl Harbor. But now their decks were nearly empty. Many of their pilots were dead. Their replacements were barely trained teenagers. Ozawa's ships had only 108 aircraft, not even enough to fill one American flight deck. Their mission was to die with dignity, to draw the Americans away from Leyte and buy time for Kurita's battleships. What they didn't know was that the Americans were already coming, with overwhelming speed and precision. At 0600 hours, radar aboard USS Essex and USS Lexington lit up again. Hundreds of green blips bloomed across the screens. The American carriers had found Ozawa. Task Force 38 turned into the wind, and once again the cycle began. Flight deck crews moved in choreographed motion. Hellcats armed with machine guns and rockets rolled forward. Helldivers loaded with 1,000-pound bombs followed behind. Avengers, heavy with torpedoes, rumbled to the catapults. The signal officers' flags rose, and the first plane thundered off the deck. Within minutes, the sea sky darkened with the silhouettes of more than 500 aircraft. They climbed in layered formations, fighter cover, bombers below, torpedo planes skimming the waves. Every 9 minutes, new squadrons launched from another carrier. It was as if the entire horizon had sprouted wings. From the bridge of Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor veteran carrier, Japanese officers watched the incoming swarm. They counted over 250 aircraft approaching from multiple directions. Anti-aircraft gunners manned their posts, but most had little ammunition left. At 0830, the first wave struck. Helldivers dove from 15,000 feet, their sirens screaming, releasing bombs that ripped through flight decks. Torpedoes streaked below, punching holes beneath the waterline. Within minutes, Chitose was aflame. Zuho was listing heavily to port. But the Americans did not stop. Even as one group returned to rearm, others were already in the air. The Essex-Class carriers operated as a relay of destruction, a perfect, unbroken chain. For every plane that landed, another took off. On USS Essex, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with sweat and hot metal. Crewmen worked bare-chested under the sun, hauling bombs, fueling lines, and pushing aircraft into position. Each deck functioned like a living organism, exhausting, deafening, precise. By mid-morning, Zuikaku was under concentrated attack. Bombs tore through her flight deck, setting off secondary explosions in the hangar below. Flames engulfed the superstructure. As water flooded her lower compartments, her captain ordered the rising sun flag to be lowered for the last time. She rolled to starboard and sank slowly, her bow pointing skyward. For Japan's naval officers, watching the Zuikaku disappear beneath the waves was like watching an empire exhale its final breath. Nearby, Chiyoda was immobilized, surrounded by American cruisers. Zuho was burning fiercely, leaving a trail of smoke 20 miles long. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. From above, American pilots saw nothing but wreckage and oil fires. The sea was a mosaic of burning fuel, orange flames flickering on black water. One pilot from USS Lexington later wrote, "It wasn't a battle. It was execution. They never had a chance to strike back." At that moment, Japan's carrier fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, ceased to exist. The Essex-Class had done what it was built to do: maintain relentless, synchronized pressure until the enemy simply vanished. Back aboard the American task force, Admiral Halsey's men were already preparing for the next phase, scouting for Kurita's remaining ships. Communications officers transmitted updates. Enemy carriers destroyed. Air superiority absolute. Below decks, mechanics and deckhands finally paused. Some sat on the steel floor, drenched in sweat and oil, staring at the horizon where columns of black smoke still rose. There was no cheering, only silence. They all knew what it meant. The Imperial Japanese Navy was finished. That evening, as darkness settled, the carriers turned south once more. Their flight decks glowed under dim red lights as crews prepared for another night of launches. Strikes against retreating Japanese battleships still threatening the Leyte invasion. Every 9 minutes, even in the dark, the rhythm continued. Engines roared. Catapults slammed. Bombers vanished into the night. The Essex-Class carriers had become more than ships. They were factories of war, industrial platforms producing destruction with machine precision. And across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command finally began to understand what they were up against. They had fought an empire. Now they faced an industry. The morning after the Battle of Leyte Gulf dawned over a silent, oil-streaked sea. The largest naval battle in human history was over. And for the first time since 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer had a functioning carrier fleet. The loss was catastrophic, not only in ships but in spirit. Japan had thrown everything it had left into the waters around the Philippines. For carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers were gone. More than 12,000 sailors were dead or missing. But beyond the numbers lay something far deeper: the end of Japan's naval doctrine, and the realization that technology, scale, and logistics had now surpassed courage and tradition. In Tokyo, senior officers received the reports in stunned silence. The names that once symbolized Japanese naval pride, Zuikaku, Chitose, Zuho Musashi, were now marked lost. Admiral Toyoda's plan, conceived as a desperate stroke of brilliance, had disintegrated into chaos. When the full picture became clear, an admiral reportedly muttered, "We have no fleet left, only ghosts." The impact rippled through every level of command. For years, Japanese naval strategy had been built on the decisive battle concept, the idea that a single, skillful engagement could determine the outcome of a war. That vision died at Leyte Gulf. The Essex-Class carriers had proven that victory no longer depended on a single battle, but on continuous industrialized warfare. American shipyards had already launched nearly 24 Essex-Class carriers, with more under construction. Each was supported by hundreds of escort vessels, thousands of aircraft, and a logistics train that spanned the Pacific. Even as one battle ended, another task group could take its place within hours. For Japan, that kind of replenishment was impossible. Fuel was running out. Training programs had collapsed. The few surviving pilots were inexperienced, often with less than 50 hours of flight time. And yet, even as reports of the defeat spread, the Japanese government chose not to broadcast it publicly. Newspapers mentioned only intense fighting near the Philippines. But among officers and sailors, the truth was unmistakable. In the surviving bases across Japan and Formosa, pilots looked at the empty hangars and knew what awaited them next: TACO or special attack units. The kamikaze doctrine, which emerged in the immediate aftermath of Leyte Gulf, was born from the ashes of the Essex-Class's victory. When Japan could no longer compete with America's scale of production, it turned instead to the only resource it had left: human lives. Meanwhile, in the American fleet, the mood was complex. The men aboard the Essex-Class carriers knew they had won something monumental, but few celebrated. The images of burning Japanese ships, of oil fires stretching for miles, left a lasting imprint. Flight deck logs recorded the statistics with mechanical precision. Sorties launched, 527. Enemy ships destroyed, 4 carriers, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers. But beneath those numbers was exhaustion. Mechanics slept beside engines. Pilots collapsed in their flight suits. For 3 days and nights, they had lived in 9-minute cycles of launch, strike, recover, refuel, a rhythm that blurred into near-mechanical existence. Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan, commander aboard USS Lexington, later said, "The men operated beyond human limits. They became part of the machine, and that machine changed naval warfare forever." The Essex-Class had not only destroyed the Japanese fleet, it had rewritten the blueprint of naval power. Airplanes, not battleships, now decided the fate of nations. And control of the sky meant control of the sea. As the fires of Leyte Gulf slowly faded, Japan's admirals faced an unanswerable question. How do you fight an enemy who can rebuild faster than you can bury your dead? That question would haunt them in the months to come, as the Essex-Class carriers turned north toward the next objective: Okinawa. By late October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed mostly on paper. Its ships were scattered, damaged, or sunk. Its pilots, once the elite of Asia, were either dead or grounded. What remained was not a fighting force but a symbol of national pride slowly dissolving under the weight of industrial reality. The defeat at Leyte Gulf marked more than the loss of vessels. It marked the collapse of an entire worldview. For decades, Japan had believed that courage, training, and divine spirit could overcome material disadvantage. At Leyte, that belief met the cold precision of the Essex-Class system, and it shattered completely. In the weeks that followed, Tokyo's naval staff convened emergency meetings. The reports were grim. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Factories were crippled by American bombing. Experienced aircrew could not be replaced fast enough. By November, Japanese commanders reached a grim consensus. If they could no longer fight technologically, they would fight spiritually. Thus, the kamikaze was born, a weapon of desperation. The first organized kamikaze attacks began just days after Leyte Gulf. Young pilots, barely trained, were told that Japan's survival depended on their willingness to die. Many volunteered. Others were pressured. The Essex-Class carriers became their primary targets. When the first kamikaze struck USS St. Lo on October 25th, it was both tragedy and symbol. A single human being, turned into a weapon, attempting to pierce the steel rhythm of American industry. The explosion sank the escort carrier, killing over 100 men. But even as smoke rose from the ship, other Essex-Class carriers continued launching aircraft without pause. The rhythm, 9 minutes, launch, recover, refuel, did not break. To the Japanese observers on shore, that endurance was incomprehensible. American logistics ships resupplied fuel, bombs, and food directly at sea. Within days, damaged aircraft were replaced, flight decks repaired, and new squadrons rotated in. Every destroyed plane was instantly replaced by 3 more. Every sunken ship had another already under construction in the shipyards at Brooklyn, Norfolk, or San Francisco. By early 1945, the Essex-Class fleet had grown to more than 20 active carriers, a floating empire that spanned the Pacific. They supported landings in Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, launching over 160,000 sorties in 6 months. Japan, unable to stop the waves, could only endure them. Inside the Japanese naval academies, officers who once studied Mahan and Togo now taught survival and sacrifice. One diary from a surviving officer read, "We cannot outbuild them. We cannot outfly them. We can only die before them." It was not resignation, it was transformation. The samurai spirit, once embodied by naval mastery, was redirected into suicidal defiance. The Essex-Class carriers had changed the equation so completely that Japan abandoned traditional warfare altogether. Meanwhile, in the United States, newsreels celebrated the victory. Headlines read, "Japan's Navy annihilated at Leyte Gulf." Yet inside the Navy itself, the mood remained disciplined. Admirals like Nimitz and Spruance understood what had truly been achieved. Not just a victory, but a technological revolution. Naval aviation was now the centerpiece of global power. The battleship era was over. Every navy in the world, British, Soviet, French, began studying the American model: centralized air power, long-range strike capacity, and synchronized carrier task forces. The Essex-Class had proven that war could be industrialized at sea, and that victory came not from singular acts of bravery, but from sustained, relentless production. Where Japan had sought a decisive battle, America had built a decisive system. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Navy could no longer challenge even a single U.S. task group. The once proud fleet that had begun the war at Pearl Harbor ended it scattered across the ocean floor. Of Japan's 25 fleet carriers, 19 were gone. Of its trained aviators, nearly all were dead. As the last survivors limped back to Japan, they passed through harbors lined with wreckage, skeletal masts, burned-out hulls, the ghosts of ships that once symbolized empire. The officers who had once spoken of destiny now spoke only of endurance. And far out to sea, under the pale moonlight, the Essex-Class carriers sailed onward. Their decks glowing red, engines humming, planes launching into the night. They had not just won a battle. They had changed the meaning of naval war forever. In the still waters of the Pacific, the echoes of Leyte Gulf slowly faded. The smoke cleared, the oil burned away, and the endless sky reflected only silence. But beneath that silence, something irreversible had changed. The Essex-Class carriers had proven more than America's might. They had proven a new law of war. That human courage alone could no longer decide the outcome of battle. That endurance, coordination, and industrial power now ruled the seas. Each of those gray giants, Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Lexington, was not just a ship, but a floating civilization. A city of 5,000 men, running on precision, trust, and repetition. Their rhythm, the takeoff every 9 minutes, was more than a military pattern. It was a heartbeat that defined a generation. For the men who served aboard them, the experience was paradoxical. They witnessed both the height of human organization and the depth of human destruction. Every successful launch meant another enemy ship burning. Every bomb dropped meant another life extinguished. They operated as part of something vast, impersonal, unstoppable. A machine of survival built in the name of victory. And yet, within that machine, humanity persisted. Sailors shared cigarettes under moonlight. Pilots wrote letters before each sortie. Mechanics risked their lives on open decks to keep engines running. The Essex-Class may have symbolized industry, but it was powered by men, ordinary Americans whose endurance turned steel into destiny. For Japan, the lesson was carved in loss. The era of the singular hero was over. Technology had eclipsed valor. And though the spirit of Bushido endured, it could no longer change the outcome of a world driven by production lines and radar screens. In the years that followed, the Essex-class ships remained refitted, modernized, some serving into the Vietnam era. They became floating monuments to an age when the ocean itself was reshaped by human invention. Today, when one walks the decks of USS Intrepid or peers into the silent hangars of USS Yorktown, the echoes of that rhythm still linger. The thunder of engines, the signal flags rising, the planes roaring into the horizon every 9 minutes. A reminder that power, once born of necessity, had transformed into permanence, and that the world after Leyte Gulf would never fight the same way again.